Welcome to our very first deep dive into diplomacy and international relations by Bastian Freiborg. Before we really get going, I want to let everyone know that this is an AI-generated podcast. All of the content here has been verified by Bastian Freiborg himself. We're kicking off a series that's going to be diving into the world of diplomacy, particularly in the context of Denmark. So if you're at all interested in international relations, global politics, or even just how Denmark navigates on the world stage, you're in the right place. Now, when we say diplomacy, it's easy to think of, maybe formal dinners and strategic handshakes, but
Yeah,
it's so much more than that. It's really the art of nations talking to each other,
exactly.
figuring things out and making things work.
That's right. It's about how countries with all their different interests and goals can find ways to coexist and cooperate. It's a carefully managed process using tools and techniques to keep those relationships going.
And it's not just about preventing wars, which is obviously crucial, but also tackling those big global issues, right?
Absolutely. Like climate change, trade, humanitarian crises. These are all areas where diplomacy is essential. It's about building bridges and finding common ground and working towards solutions together.
I think what's fascinating is that diplomacy has been around for centuries. I mean, way back to ancient civilizations.
It has.
Really?
And it's fascinating that even then, they understood the power of communication and negotiation. Think about ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. They had envoys and established diplomatic channels to maintain peaceful relations.
Makes you realize that human nature hasn't really changed that much, has it? We still need to find ways to get along.
Exactly, and the methods have evolved, but the core principles of diplomacy remain the same: building trust, resolving conflicts peacefully, and advancing shared interests.
So how did diplomacy change from those early days to, say, the medieval period?
Well, during the Middle Ages, diplomacy was used primarily by monarchs. It was all about securing alliances, navigating those complex power dynamics,
Yeah.
and trying to maintain stability in a time of frequent conflict.
Mm.
Think strategic marriages and treaties. Those were the tools of the trade back then.
It sounds like a different world.
It was.
Almost like a game of chess with incredibly high stakes.
As we move into the modern era, diplomacy had to adapt to a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected and complex. Globalization, new technologies, wider range of actors, it all changed the landscape of diplomacy.
So it's not just kings and queens making deals anymore.
Not at all. Today, we have various types of diplomacy at play. State diplomacy is the classic one, where governments use all sorts of tools, from negotiations and treaties to cultural exchanges, to advance their interests.
That makes sense. It's like the official face of a country's interactions with the world.
Right. Then there's multilateral diplomacy. This is where multiple states come together within organizations like the UN, the EU, or NATO to tackle shared challenges. It's about recognizing that some problems are too big for any one country to solve alone.
So it's like teamwork on a global scale.
Exactly. And then we have bilateral diplomacy, which focuses specifically on the relationship between two countries. Think of it like a close partnership where you work together on issues of mutual interest, maybe through trade deals or joint initiatives.
So within this complex web of diplomatic interactions, who are the key players?
Well, diplomats are at the heart of it all. They act as representatives of their countries abroad, building those crucial relationships and navigating the often subtle world of international relations.
I imagine it requires a very specific skill set.
It does. Diplomats need to be skilled communicators, negotiators, and strategists. They need a deep understanding of their own country's interests, but also the ability to see things from other perspectives. They often operate in high-pressure environments, where every word and gesture matters.
And they play a crucial role in resolving conflicts peacefully, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They're trained in negotiation and mediation, working tirelessly to de-escalate tensions and find solutions that everyone can live with. Their job is to prevent conflicts from escalating into violence, and that's no easy feat.
It sounds like a career that requires not only knowledge, but also a great deal of tact and diplomacy. Pun intended, of course.
You could say that. And to help them do their job effectively, diplomats are granted diplomatic immunity. This protection isn't about giving them special treatment. It's about ensuring they can operate independently, without fear of undue pressure or interference.
That makes sense. It's about protecting the integrity of the process itself.
Exactly. And that's crucial for maintaining open communication and trust between nations.
Now, we've talked about some of the more well-known aspects of diplomacy, but I'm curious, are there any lesser-known concepts or methods that you think people should be aware of?
There are a few. For instance, there's the concept of a diplomatic corps, which refers to all the diplomats, from different countries, stationed in a particular country or region. It's like a mini United Nations operating within each nation, fostering communication and collaboration.
That's a great way to put it. So it's like a constant exchange of ideas and perspectives happening on a global scale.
It is. And then there's public diplomacy, which focuses on building relationships and influencing public opinion in other countries. This can involve things like cultural exchange programs, educational initiatives, or even just sharing information about your country's culture and values. It's all about building bridges and fostering positive perceptions.
So it sounds like it's about winning hearts and minds, as much as it is about negotiating treaties.
Exactly. Building those people-to-people connections can be incredibly powerful.
You mentioned earlier that there are different tracks of diplomacy. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Of course. Track 1 diplomacy is the official government-to-government type we've been discussing. But there's also Track 2 diplomacy, which involves non-state actors like academics, NGOs, or even influential individuals. They can often act as intermediaries or facilitators in conflict resolution, bringing different perspectives and expertise to the table.
So they're like unofficial diplomats working behind the scenes.
You could say that. And then there's Track 3 diplomacy, which focuses on those people-to-people interactions we talked about. Think student exchanges, cultural collaborations, or even just tourism. It's about fostering understanding and breaking down barriers at a grassroots level.
It seems like all these different tracks are ultimately working towards the same goal, a more peaceful and cooperative world.
They are, and they each play a vital role in shaping the broader landscape of international relations.
Okay, so we've covered the players, the types, the tracks, but how does diplomacy fit into the bigger picture of international politics? What's its overall role?
Diplomacy is really the cornerstone of international relations. It's the foundation upon which we build peace, stability, and cooperation between nations. It's about managing differences, resolving disputes, and finding ways to work together on shared challenges.
So it's not just about fancy dinners and handshakes after all.
Not at all. It's a complex, multifaceted process that is absolutely essential for a functioning global community. It's the art of building bridges, not walls.
I'm starting to see that. And it seems particularly crucial when it comes to conflict resolution.
It is. Diplomacy offers a peaceful alternative to military action. It's about using dialogue negotiation and those established channels to find solutions that address the root causes of conflict. And it's always the preferred option. War should always be the last resort.
But I imagine diplomacy isn't always easy. There must be challenges, right?
Of course. Diplomacy is often a delicate balancing act. You're dealing with competing interests, political dynamics, historical baggage, sometimes a lack of trust between nations. Finding common ground can be extremely difficult, especially when you're dealing with complex issues or deeply rooted disagreements.
It sounds like it requires a lot of patience skill and a deep understanding of human nature as well as international relations.
It does. It's a craft that takes years to master, and even then there are no guarantees of success. But the potential rewards in terms of preventing conflict and building a more cooperative world make it an incredibly worthwhile endeavor.
Now, I'm particularly interested in how all of this relates to Denmark. I mean, are there any unique aspects to Danish diplomacy that make it stand out on the world stage?
There are. One of the most interesting things about Danish diplomacy is this idea that everyone is a diplomat. It's a philosophy that permeates the country's approach to international relations.
What does that mean exactly? Does everyone in Denmark have a diplomatic passport?
Not quite, but it does mean that a wide range of actors, from government officials and members of the royal family to business leaders and even ordinary citizens, are actively involved in promoting Denmark's interests and values abroad.
It's a very inclusive and proactive approach.
It is, and it reflects a deeply ingrained belief in its importance of international engagement and cooperation. Denmark sees itself as a small nation with a global outlook, and it leverages all its resources to make its voice heard and contribute to a better world.
That's an inspiring vision. But with so many people involved in diplomacy, does that diminish the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? I mean, is it still relevant in this context?
Absolutely. In fact, the ministry's role becomes even more crucial in this environment. Think about it. With everyone engaging in diplomacy, you need a central hub to coordinate all those efforts and ensure consistency in Denmark's foreign policy.
So the ministry acts as a kind of conductor, orchestrating the various diplomatic initiatives.
That's a good analogy. The ministry also provides the expertise and experience needed to navigate the increasingly complex international landscape. They bring a long-term perspective, ensuring that Denmark's diplomatic efforts are effective and aligned with its national interests.
So even in a world where everyone is a diplomat, The Ministry of Foreign Affairs remains a vital institution.
It is. It's the foundation upon which Denmark's international engagement is built, providing the structure expertise and continuity needed for successful diplomacy. Now, this idea of everyone as a diplomat, it raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? I mean, if diplomacy is truly everyone's business, then where does that leave the average citizen?
That's a great point, and it's something I'd love to delve into further. But before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I have a thought-provoking question for you to consider. If everyone can be a diplomat, what does that mean for you? How can understanding the complexities of diplomacy empower individuals to engage more effectively in shaping their nation's role on the world stage? We'll continue our exploration of diplomacy in the next part of this deep dive. Until then, keep those thoughts brewing. And be sure to join us next time as we delve even deeper into the fascinating world of diplomacy and international relations by Bastian Freiborg.
It's a thought-provoking question indeed, and it gets to the heart of how diplomacy is evolving in a world where the lines between the personal and the political are becoming increasingly blurred.
Exactly. It's no longer something that happens solely behind closed doors in embassies and government offices. But before we get too philosophical, I'm curious about the actual nuts and bolts of diplomacy. What are some of the key methods and techniques used in those high-level negotiations?
Well, it's a unique skill set. Diplomatic negotiations are a delicate dance that requires a blend of strategic thinking, persuasive communication, and a deep understanding of human psychology.
It sounds like it's as much about reading people as it is about understanding policy.
Absolutely. You need to be able to build rapport, establish trust, and find those subtle points of leverage that can lead to a mutually beneficial outcome. It's not about winners and losers. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
So what are some of the guiding principles that shape these negotiations?
One fundamental principle is reciprocity. It's the idea that you need to be willing to give something to get something. Diplomacy is about finding that balance of give and take, understanding what each side values and what they're willing to concede.
Like any relationship, really, it needs to be a two-way street.
Exactly. And compromise is another cornerstone of diplomacy. Rarely does one side get everything it wants. It's about finding that sweet spot where everyone can walk away feeling like they've achieved something meaningful, even if it means making concessions along the way.
So it's about finding common ground, even when there are significant differences.
Precisely. And that often involves thinking outside the box, being creative, and finding solutions that address the underlying interests, not just the stated positions. Diplomats need to be able to see the bigger picture and understand the long-term implications of their actions.
I imagine that requires a great deal of flexibility and adaptability. Things don't always go according to plan, do they?
They rarely do. The diplomatic negotiations can be unpredictable, with unexpected twists and turns along the way. You need to be able to adjust your strategy on the fly, be responsive to new information, and seize opportunities as they arise. It's a very dynamic process.
Yeah, I'm guessing that cultural sensitivity plays a big role as well.
It's essential. Diplomats need to be aware of the cultural norms and values of their counterparts. Misunderstandings can easily arise if you're not attuned to those subtle nuances of communication, both verbal and nonverbal.
It sounds like diplomacy requires a deep understanding of human psychology, as much as it does international relations.
It does. It's about understanding motivations, fears, aspirations, the things that drive human behavior. It's about building bridges across cultures and finding that common thread of humanity that connects us all.
We've focused a lot on the formal aspects of diplomacy, but I'm also curious about the role of those informal interactions, the ones that happen outside of conference rooms and negotiating tables.
Those informal moments can be incredibly valuable. Diplomatic dinners, social gatherings, cultural events, they all provide opportunities to build rapport, exchange ideas, and explore potential areas of cooperation in a more relaxed setting.
It's about building those personal connections that can sometimes make all the difference.
Exactly. Those informal settings can help to break down barriers, humanize the process, and foster a sense of trust and shared purpose. They can be particularly helpful when formal negotiations have reached an impasse, offering a way to step back, re-engage, and find a fresh perspective.
So it's not all about stuffy protocols and official pronouncements. There's a human element to diplomacy as well.
Absolutely, and it's often in those unscripted moments, those casual conversations where real progress is made.
Now let's bring this back to Denmark. We talked earlier about this idea that everyone is a diplomat in the Danish context. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's a philosophy that's woven into the fabric of Danish society. It means that a wide range of actors, from government officials to members of the royal family, to business leaders and even ordinary citizens, are actively engaged in promoting Denmark's interests and values on the world stage.
So it's a very decentralized and multifaceted approach.
It is, and it reflects a deep commitment to international engagement and cooperation. Denmark sees itself as a small nation with a global outlook, and it leverages all its resources to make its voice heard and contribute to a better world.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how this everyone is a diplomat philosophy plays out in real-world situations?
Certainly, let's start with the royal family. The Danish monarchy has a long tradition of international engagement, and the Queen and other members of the royal family regularly undertake official visits to other countries, representing Denmark and promoting its interests.
So they're not just figureheads, they're active participants in Danish diplomacy.
Precisely, they use their platform to strengthen relationships, promote trade and investment, and showcase Denmark's culture and values. Their involvement carries a lot of weight on the international stage.
And what about the role of government officials outside of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
Well, Danish ministers and officials from various ministries are actively engaged in international negotiations and collaborations. They're working to advance Danish interests in areas like trade, climate change development, and security.
So it's not just the foreign minister who's doing the diplomatic heavy lifting.
Not at all. It's a team effort, with expertise and input coming from across the government. This ensures that Denmark's diplomatic efforts are aligned with its broader policy goals, and that there's a unified front on the world stage.
And how do business leaders and ordinary citizens fit into this model?
Well, Danish companies are known for their innovation and global reach. They play a crucial role in promoting Denmark's economic interests abroad, acting as ambassadors for Danish expertise and quality. They build relationships, open doors for trade and investment, and contribute to a positive image of Denmark.
So they're essentially economic diplomats.
You could say that. And then there are ordinary citizens who contribute to Danish diplomacy through their work in NGOs, their participation in cultural exchanges, or even just through their interactions with people from other countries. It's about fostering those people-to-people connections that can lead to greater understanding and cooperation.
It's about recognizing that even small actions can have a ripple effect on the global stage.
Exactly, every interaction, every conversation has the potential to build bridges and promote a more interconnected and collaborative world.
This everyone is a diplomat approach seems to be working well for Denmark. It's certainly giving the country an outsized voice on the world stage.
It has, and it reflects a deep commitment to multilateralism and a belief in the power of cooperation to solve global challenges.
But with so many actors involved, how does Denmark ensure that its diplomatic efforts are coordinated and effective? I mean, it seems like it could easily become chaotic.
That's where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs plays a critical role. As we discussed earlier, the ministry acts as a central hub, coordinating Denmark's diplomatic activities, providing expertise, ensuring consistency, and maintaining a long-term strategic vision.
So it's about striking that balance between a decentralized engagement and centralized coordination.
Precisely, the ministry connects the various strands of Danish diplomacy, ensuring that they're all pulling in the same direction and working towards shared goals. It's like a conductor leading an orchestra, bringing together different instruments to create a harmonious symphony.
This has given me a much deeper appreciation for the complexities and nuances of Danish diplomacy. It's a dynamic and multifaceted system.
It is, and it's a system that reflects Denmark's values, its history, and its vision for a more cooperative and interconnected world. Now, this brings us back to that question you posed earlier about the role of the individual in diplomacy.
Yes, about how we can all be diplomats in our own lives. It's a fascinating concept, and one that I think deserves further exploration. But perhaps we can delve into that in the final part of our deep dive.
I think that's a great idea. It's a topic that's both timely and relevant, especially in today's world.
So we've talked about how Denmark approaches diplomacy with this everyone is a diplomat mindset. But what does that actually mean for someone like me or for any of our listeners? How can we as individuals become more effective diplomats in our own lives?
It's a great question, and one that's particularly relevant in today's interconnected world. We might not all have diplomatic passports or negotiate treaties, but we can still embody the spirit of diplomacy in our everyday interactions.
I like that idea, the spirit of diplomacy. What does that look like in a practical sense?
It starts with recognizing that we are all global citizens. Our actions, no matter how small they seem, can have ripple effects that extend far beyond our immediate circles. It's about approaching every interaction, whether it's with a neighbor, a colleague, or someone from a completely different culture, with respect, empathy, and a willingness to understand their perspective.
So it's about those fundamental values of communication and understanding that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's about actively listening, seeking common ground, and being open to different perspectives, even when we might disagree. It's about building bridges instead of walls.
I think a lot of people would agree with those values in principle, but how do we put them into practice in a world that can often feel quite divided and polarized?
It's certainly a challenge, but I think it starts with small steps. For example, something as simple as choosing to engage in respectful dialogue with someone who holds different views than our own can be a powerful act of diplomacy. Instead of shutting down the conversation, we can try to understand where they're coming from, what their concerns are, and what common ground we might share.
So it's about having those difficult conversations, but doing so in a way that's constructive and respectful.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that even in disagreement, there's an opportunity for learning and growth. And sometimes simply listening with an open mind can be enough to bridge divides and foster understanding.
And I imagine that travel and cultural exchange can play a big role in broadening our perspectives and making us more effective everyday diplomats.
Absolutely. Experiencing different cultures firsthand allows us to step outside our comfort zones, challenge our assumptions, and appreciate the incredible diversity of human experience. It helps us see the world through different lenses and connect with people on a deeper level.
It's about moving beyond those stereotypes and recognizing our shared humanity.
Exactly. Whether it's traveling to a foreign country, engaging with a diverse community in our own city, or simply reading a book about a different culture, exposing ourselves to different ways of life can make us more empathetic, understanding, and effective communicators.
And those skills are essential, not just for diplomats, but for anyone who wants to navigate our increasingly interconnected world successfully.
They are, and I think it's important to remember that even though we might not all be involved in formal diplomacy, we all have a role to play in shaping a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world.
That's a powerful message.
Oh.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of diplomacy, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will remember?
I hope they've gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and nuance of diplomacy, both in the traditional sense and in our everyday lives. I hope they've learned about the different tools and techniques that diplomats use to navigate the world stage, and that they've been inspired by Denmark's "everyone is a diplomat" philosophy.
It's certainly been an enlightening journey for me. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this exploration of diplomacy and international relations by Bastian Freiburg. We hope you found it insightful and engaging, and we encourage you to continue exploring the fascinating world of diplomacy. Remember, as we've learned today, diplomacy is not just for diplomats. It's something we can all practice in our own lives, starting with our next interaction. So go out there, be an everyday diplomat, and help build a more understanding and cooperative world.